Welcome to West Coast Thrills and Chills, sponsored by Crime Writers of Canada. I'm SM Freedman, and you can call me Shoshana. And I'll introduce myself in a bit more depth later, along with the amazing crime authors I have with me on this panel. But before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that this festival takes place on the ancestral unceded territory of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish Coast Salish peoples. So for those who, like me, descend from colonists of this land, I urge that we strive to honor this legacy with respect and compassion. And as we're coming up to Truth and Reconciliation Day in a couple of weeks, to consider how to best make reparations for the cultural genocide that occurred on these lands that we now have the privilege of calling home. I'd also like to thank our generous sponsors and donors, the Canada Arts Council, the Canada Heritage Fund, BC Gaming, Creative BC, the City of Vancouver, DBVIA, the Hamber Foundation, the Joseph Wask Foundation, the Asian Canadian Writers Workshop, CWILL, Pace and Associates, the Federation of BC Writers, the League of Canadian Poets, the Writers Union of Canada, and the Surrey Public Library. For a full list of partners, please visit wordvancouver.com. And if you haven't already, please consider making a donation by becoming a member or through the silent auction on the website. Also, please note that our books are available to purchase from the official bookseller, 32 Books, located in front of the theater. West Coast Thrills and Chills is sponsored by Crime Writers of Canada. It was established in June 1982 by Derek Murdoch with a mission of promoting amazing Canadian crime writers, such as the panelists you see before me today. To learn more about this CWC or to become a member, please visit our table, and we'll be here all day, or check out our website, crimewritersofcanada.com. You don't have to be a published author to join, and I have to say for me personally that my membership with the CWC has been one of the most valuable investments I've ever made in my career, as it's led me to a supportive and inclusive community of fellow writers. And though we may write about mayhem and murder, in my experience, most of crime writers are the nicest people you'll ever meet, and we only kill on paper. Now, to the main event, West Coast Thrills and Chills, a CWC Awards of Excellence prize-winning short story, a riveting psychological thriller involving a dissociative identity, a dangerous Cambodian investigation with a gutsy heroine, a mysterious text that's a prelude to murder. Please join us as we read from a delicious assortment of our criminally inclined work. First, I have the honor of introducing K.L. Abrahamson, author of the police procedural Detective Kazakov mysteries and the amateur sleuth Phoebe Clay mysteries. Karen's short fiction can be found in various anthologies, as well as Ellery Queen Mystery Magazine and Black Cat Mystery Magazine. The fourth Phoebe Clay novel, Trapped on Cedar Trails, was released last November. Her work has been described as having a connection to culture and powerful characters that make an incredible story. When she isn't writing, Karen can be found with a camera and backpack in fabulous locations around the world. K.L. Abrahamson.
Thanks, Shoshana. Wow, applause. So I'm going to read today. I'm not going to read from the earlier Phoebe Clay books. I'm going to read from a book in progress in the series. The Phoebe Clay mysteries follow Phoebe Clay, who is an ex-school teacher suffering with PTSD brought on by a school shooting and by the aftermath of the school shooting, which led in which there were findings that she was somehow negligent, and this led to the shooting. So through this series of books, we've got her dealing with the PTSD. We also have her dealing with a series of adventures. The first one takes her up to a fictitious place in the Pacific Northwest, kayaking with orcas and dealing with a dead whale and a dead young man, which Phoebe then investigates. She then moves on to a family vacation in Kochi, India, and yes, I have been there, and dealing with the death of their tour guide and when her sister becomes the main suspect. Book 3 takes her to Cambodia on her own, dealing with child trafficking as well as other things of an environmental nature at Angkor. And the last book brings her back to BC, dealing with a killer, the Pacific Northwest rainforest, and grizzly bears. And then the book we're currently working on brings her to the point where she is finally trying to confront her past and the events that occurred in the school. But when the man responsible for the allegations against her turns up dead, she becomes the chief suspect. So here is the opening chapter of the book that I am currently calling Drowned by Guilt and History. So that's the working title. It was a school, a high school, just like any other high school, with students just like any other students. It would have the same smell of gym strip and cafeteria lunches, the same echoing student voices, the same petty dramas. She taught in buildings like this for years, and yet her heart thumped like a piston in her chest, and she wanted to run, shove through the clods of students arriving almost late for the first class of the day, and go anywhere else but here. The school was even new. The tall, narrow windows of the huge central glass atrium were plastered golden by the early September light. 2 wings of classrooms swept from either side. New rhododendron beds edged the street in glossy dark green. Nothing to be wary of, nothing to be scared of at all. And yet, after almost 30 years of teaching, she, Phoebe Clay, stood here as frozen as a grade 8 student with stage fright. Her stomach was knotted, sweat flowed from her hairline down the nape of her neck and stuck her silk blouse to her back. Last time she stepped into a school, the day her career and life pretty much ended too, at least her old normal life. Damn Derek for demanding that their meeting be here. Neutral ground, he'd called it. Neutral like heck. Aunt B? The familiar young voice swung Phoebe around and her rapid breathing subsided a little. Her 16-year-old niece, Alice, approached with 2 of her friends. What are you doing here? There was no way Alice wanted her friends reminded of her Aunt Phoebe's role in a school shooting. Would you believe I'm visiting an old friend? Leave names out of it. It was better that way. Schools were rumor mills enough as it was. A buzzer sounded inside the school. You better get going, Phoebe said. You don't want your teacher thinking you don't care about your education. You look great, Aunt B. Professional, Alice said as she and the girls scooted towards the door. But then Alice turned back, a gleam of encouragement in her eyes. Good luck, she called. The dreaded girl had seen the difficulty her old aunt was having, and darn it all, Phoebe didn't want to disappoint Alice. Phoebe started toward the door, for Alice, for herself, if she was ever going to clear her name of the school district findings. Before she could hesitate, she yanked open one of the school's double doors and stepped into the huge central atrium. Another buzzer sounded. No teachers in sight, no security either, which was a bit of a surprise after the historical events that brought her here. Classroom doors thunked shut and footfalls faded. The hum of voices came through the walls. She followed the signs to the administration office. Inside, protective glass barriers blocked any direct access to the receptionist or the staff area. A couple of incredibly young teachers talked next to an archaic wall of teacher mail slots. On Phoebe's side of the glass protection, 2 solid-looking wooden doors stood at the rear of the room, probably leading to the principal and VP's office. I have an appointment with Principal Murphy, Phoebe said through the small speaker in the barrier. Your name, please? Phoebe gave it, and the 2 teachers paused to look at her. She tried to smile, but her face didn't seem to be working correctly. If she could just catch her breath, the room might stop spinning. Ma'am? Ms. Clay? The receptionist looked up at her with concern. Are you all right? Do you need to sit down? Phoebe's feet were miles below her, barely attached by balloon lines, and she was floating away. At least that was what she wanted to do. No, thank you. I want to speak to Derek Murphy, please. I have an appointment. Her voice was too strident if she was trying to keep it together, she was falling apart. Suddenly, one of the solid wood doors opened at the end of the administration area, and Principal Derek Murphy stepped out. She'd known the man for over 3 decades. At least she thought she had. He was a newly minted vice principal when she began teaching, and his collegial approach had made teaching a dream job. At the time, he'd been tall, distinguished man with a swimmer's build, blazing blue eyes, and a head of thick, graying black hair. But he'd maintained a reserve around his professional life and a professional demeanor in the impeccable tailoring of his gray suit. The man who stepped out of the office was irrevocably changed, startlingly so. Still tall, but his broad swimmer's shoulders slumped in a faded gray suit gone shiny at the knees. His scalp showed through his thinning hair. His large hook nose, loose jowls, and mottled skin reminded her of a pelican who ruined her life. But then the harmless-seeming birds did swallow smaller birds whole. Derek, she said, steadying herself, it didn't quite work. It was hard to think. Her mouth was desert dry. Phoebe Clay, it's been what, 7 years at least? He crossed his arms over his chest instead of shaking her hand. For protection? From her? You said on the phone we needed to speak, he said, clearly not wanting to invite her into his office. I thought we needed to talk about, she cleared her throat, about what happened. About what happened? Derek's head bobbed, reinforcing her original avian impression. And suddenly she understood. He wanted witnesses. He knew he'd lied all those years ago and was afraid of what Phoebe might do. That was why he demanded that she see him in the school. He felt safe here. Phoebe, what happened is a matter of public record. If she wanted to really discuss things with him, she'd better assert herself. She wasn't going to be walked over. Derek, we need to talk. Privately. She met his gaze the way she had in the old days when she convinced him to deal with a student in a particular way. Please, in honor of those who were lost. Derek flinched, but he finally relented and led Phoebe into his office. The room was a hodgepodge of things she remembered and things she did not, a not so gentle kaleidoscopic reminder of what she'd lost. A large metal desk filled the center of the room with a small meeting table in one corner next to a window. Derek chose to put the desk between them and sank into his chair. Behind him were old school photos, including a faculty image where she stood beside him, probably taken from the year before the shooting. So he hadn't forgotten her entirely. He just didn't want to face what he'd done. She settled into one of the chairs. One of the last times we sat like this, we were talking about Rick Hames and his sister. I told you about the harassment of the Hames girl and how Rick was attempting to intervene. I told you something had to be done. You told me to leave it with you. Was that a shimmer of guilt across his face? He placed his palms squarely on the desk. I don't recall such a conversation. There were never any issues with the Hames girl, but Rick was an ongoing sore point for everyone. He had anger management and mental health issues. The shooting occurred with no warning. Damn it, Derek, the conversation happened. Rick had every reason to be angry given what was happening. I even followed our meeting up with an email, but you never got back to me and nothing ever happened. So finally, Rick took matters into his own hands and brought a gun to school. She clutched the chair arms, fighting for composure. It haunts me, Derek. It does. Why did you contradict what I said in the hearing? You made it look like I was negligent. I want my life back, but how can I move on when everything about me is shadowed by that incident? Derek leaned back in his chair. Phoebe, you were an excellent teacher, but it has been almost 7 years since the incident, and I didn't want to say this over the phone, but I'm concerned that you may have created false memories of the events. I'm sorry you haven't been able to get your life in order, but the rest of us have moved on and have jobs to do. I believe you were provided with a full pension, perhaps counseling. She wanted to slap him. She wanted to scream. A full pension is not my reputation. Everywhere I go, someone remembers what I'm alleged to have done or not done, as the case may be. It isn't right that I have a dark cloud following me. But Phoebe, it's the truth. It's a matter of public record. And we both know that the public record isn't necessarily the truth. I thought after all this time, you might have reconsidered your story and want to tell the truth this time. His eyes widened. For a moment, he seemed to forget to breathe. What the hell are you alleging? I'm not alleging anything. Please, Derek, we always worked so well together. I thought we were friends. We shouldn't have this awfulness between us. Derek stood. The only reason I agreed to meet with you at all is because of our history. I feel sorry for you, but it's done and over. Bodies are buried and people have grieved. I'm not opening that pain up again. No, I think you should leave. Some of us have jobs to do, and the start of the school year is always busy. But you know that. This was a hard face, Derek. She didn't know. The bird-faced creature that ate other birds. He He passed behind her to open the door. I have work to do, and you have no business in this school, so I'll ask you to leave. From her purse, she pulled a note she'd agonized over last night. She placed it on his desk. My number, in case you change your mind. You always were a dog with a bone. Leave before I call security. She left Derek's office. The receptionist had the phone at her ear, her fingers over the speed dial. The teachers had given up pretending to have other business. Thank you for your time, Derek. I don't want any trouble. Leave now. He nodded at the receptionist who spoke into the phone. Phoebe left administration for the school's main doors, but not before 2 security guards caught up to her, and not before 2 familiar-looking students entered the school, friends of Alice's. They raised their hands, but their greeting was truncated when they realized the guards were escorting Phoebe. Phoebe groaned. Alice so wouldn't appreciate the rumors.
Thank you. That was awesome. Okay, next we have Craig Bowlsby, who is a prolific author of short stories, and I have to say he has created some of the best titles I have ever heard, primarily in the mystery and sci-fi genres. So in 2023, his story, The Girl Who Was Only 3/4 Dead, right? Published by Mystery Magazine, won the Crime Writers of Canada Award of Excellence. Another story, Black Tie for Murder, was longlisted for the Marjorie Allingham Short Mystery Competition. Other recent published works include Boda and the Swarm, The Day the Earth Didn't Stand Still, The Last Run of Old 248, The Last of the Shamrocks, One Day in Tom's Life with Ice Cream, I think that's my favorite, and Translate This. Craig's unpublished novel, Requiem for a Lotus, was shortlisted for the 2023 CLUE Book Awards and a finalist for the 2023 Killer Nashville Claymore Award. Outside of writing, Craig has also won the Western Canadian Fencing Championship 5 times. Craig Bowlsby.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So I'll just read the beginning section of my short story, The Girl Who Was Only 3/4 Dead. It's a near future story. I don't really know when exactly it takes place, maybe about 18 years from now. And this is exactly what's going to happen. Okay. I could see about 50 nude bodies scattered through the warehouse, lying on gurneys and covered in wires, tubes, and electrodes. Winding my way through the maze, I looked for the gurney numbers. A white smocked technician in the middle of the operation ignored me and banged a portable machine with his fist. The whole room, the size of a basketball court, pinged and jingled like a huge arcade machine. Suki was number 13. I found her gurney and then shouted up at a guy on a catwalk riding a desk. He spied me and nodded and then tapped a few buttons on a console. Suki's gurney hummed and bleeped. Her small, naked body seemed protean, unmade. She looked very skinny, very dead, which she was. She committed legal suicide 2 years ago. It was all the rage, even in Vancouver. The feds called it dormancy, but everyone else called it deadland. So now she looked like a test tube zombie, anemic with dark skid-mark brows, roughly shaved head with chestnut-colored fuzz, pert nose, small mouth sucking on a big tube. But it was better than final suicide, which I guess was the point. The floor technician moved to the gurney and tapped a keyboard, causing graph levels on the screen to rise and fall. Suki jerked, rattled, and moaned. This lasted about 3 minutes, during which I checked the messages on my pocket pod. Business was business. But no one had any private investigation gigs for me, just a few insults. Also, one hollow greeting from my bank manager, wearing a Hawaiian shirt sticking up a foot tall from my pod, smiling and bowing. He could have been a real Hawaiian leprechaun standing in my hand. They were making hollows so lifelike now. But my bank balance was still just a ghost. I watched Suki's bare chest and small breasts rising and falling. Then the techie pulled out the mouth hose and Suki threw up or spit up. I couldn't tell which. Her breath sucked in and out, eyes still closed. A long whine rippled from her throat. The techie injected something into one of her intravenous tubes, and she screamed in pain and rattled some more. He pulled open her eyes and squirted fluid in them, and then wiped her face and nose. He jotted down some figures as Suki groaned and panted. Her dark, filmy eyes blinked open and roamed. Finally, she settled on me. Her face contorted and she gurgled, which I took to be interrogative. I said, "It's me, Gabe. They're reviving you and they're kicking you out." The lady behind the desk had great facial art, like world sea waves. Very Japanese, the waves. I didn't use tattoos. My scars were my art. Her name was Person Carroll, very professional, young but confident, bored but hiding it well. A huge window overlooked the bustle of the eastern half of Burrard Inlet from 20 stories up. "You were Suki Hannah, age 28 at time of suicide," said Person Carroll. "Your maximum term hasn't been completed. You signed on for 5 years." Suki fidgeted in a two-piece black leather jacket and pants that accentuated her skinniness. She rasped, "I didn't want you to chop my hair off." Her vocal cords hadn't returned to normal yet. "Noted. And this person, Mr. Gabriel Sam, is your contact?" "Yes," growled Suki. "No next of kin?" "No." I'd known Suki since we were kids. I worked for her father as an investigator until he and his wife X'd in an auto accident. But 2 years ago, Suki had gone crackers when her husband left her for another woman. He'd also taken most of Suki's assets and disappeared, but not before dropping a divorce on her through their prenup. "I see we have revived you early," said Person Carroll, "for refusal of payment. Your payment stopped months ago." "What happened to my money?" moaned Suki. "It was my account." "I'll find out," I said. "There's one other problem," said Person Carroll apologetically. "Given your debt to the federal government, any and all of your assets have been frozen, including your current persona and your retinal scans." "Girl of a bitch," said Suki. I said, "Are you blanking her?" "We don't use that term. We're holding her persona until payment is made. That's standard. All bank accounts, government services, known identity numbers, and her retinal scans will be frozen, including the right to her name for official purposes." "Well, how much does she owe?" $11,140.35. I dropped 35 cents on her desk. "We'll be back with the rest." "Thank you," said Person Carroll. "But in the meantime, I need Person Suki to sign some forms. Have you read these forms, and do you understand the nature of these forms?" "Are you kidding?" said Suki. "Let's put it this way," said Person Carroll. "If you don't sign them, we have no obligation to return your persona when you do make payment." "I could buy another persona." "Yes, but it's cheaper to pay us for the previous one. Besides, without signing these forms, you're still considered dormant, technically. And believe me, that's bad. But this clears you of a lot of red tape, and you can get out of here right away. And otherwise, you won't get any follow-up treatment, and that's bad." Suki grabbed the forms and scrawled on them. "I've got nothing anyway." I asked, "How long do we have to pay?" Carol shrugged. "Indefinitely, unless we sue. But the state has the right to sell her persona after a reasonable period of time." "And how long is that?" "The minimum wait is 1 month." 1 month. Then she'll really be a ghost. She'll be effectively dead. Well, not exactly. Just 3/4 worth. The bureaucrat shrugged. "Okay," I said, "we'll be back before that." But Suki wasn't listening. She sat up straight and her eyes bugged out. She said, "Do you see that elephant?" "What elephant?" "No, I don't." "Oh my God, it's. Suki drooped forward, her eyes staring at nothing. Her mouth went slack. "What the hell?" I said, and pushed her back into her seat. Person Carroll sighed. "You'll need to talk to a specialist. There's one in this building, bottom floor." Suki slept open-mouthed on a divan in Dr. Ottoman's office, like a dead fish. Her head bristled with wires and electrodes from a machine. Some of the wires stuck right into Suki's brain. "It's a combination," said the doc, rubbing his thick mustache and adjusting his black glasses. His only tattoo was a snake on his chin, none on his bald head. His office was small but expensively furnished. "Depression and psychosis," he continued. "It affects some a lot more than others. Part of her is pulling herself back. She wants to stay dead, and she'll probably die all the way. But this is rehab. Unfortunately, Person Hannah's subsidy is frozen. Her persona is frozen. But she signed for it. She was told the federal government doesn't apply. The federal program doesn't apply, I'm afraid. Not in this case. And the rehab's much more expensive now, ever since Mersanto took over the rehab system. But it's not like it's not available. We still offer it." meaning it will cost, well, maybe 10,000. And without it, how long? Maybe a month, maybe less. And then she'll slip back into the dream world. And then the brain just stops. You can only induce a coma for so long, and then you get psychosis problems when you reanimate. You see, the brain fills in the gaps of what it expects. If it expects the freedom to conjure up deep-rooted visions, and if nothing stops it, then it'll persist. They had to push her brain into extended REM sleep to keep it from atrophying during the long suicide. Can't she take anything? She needs sleep to satisfy the subconscious, but that'll only go so far. I can't give her antipsychotic drugs because it's not a chemical imbalance, and the side effects will soon make it worse. There must be something else. Just deep electrode stimulation, that's the only clinical cure. We lost a lot of patients in the early days, just in the suicide, until we forced their brains to ramp up during the coma. The doc pulled out a form. If money's a problem, she can always sell one of her organs. Look, I'll show you. No thanks, doc. How long can you keep her hooked up to that thing? For free? I guess. The office closes at 4:30 sharp. I spent a few hours on some errands before the doc woke Suki up. Then we embarked on the trail of Suki's life, or death. I didn't tell her what the doc said. That's it. Thank you.
Fabulous. Okay. Third, we have Karen Dodd. She's a novelist living in a tiny seaside village of the west coast of BC. Her atmospheric thrillers are set in the achingly beautiful but dark underbellies of Italy and Malta. Her second novel, Scare Away the Dark, won the Chanticleer CLUE Award. She is currently writing a psychological thriller set in the Pacific Northwest. She is a member of Crime Writers of Canada, past president of the North Shore Writers Association, and current president of the Canada West chapter of Sisters in Crime, which is also an amazing organization, and their table is joined up with Crime Writers of Canada, so come check us out at both sides of the table. Karen Dodd.
Thank you, Shoshona. Excuse me. I'm going to read today from my latest book, everybody knows, Niccolo Moretti crime thriller. And just to put it in context for you, I'm going to start right from the first chapter, but investigative, real life investigative reporter Daphne Caruana Galizia was assassinated October the 16th, 2017. For investigating corruption at the highest level of government in Malta. You may have seen some of it in the papers. I was there in April 2018 and knew nothing about it until I came back to Canada and started researching money laundering for this third book. So as you do, you go down rabbit holes with research. And although I'd been in Malta for a week, the research really, I became so passionate about the real life story, which is fictionalized in Everybody Knows, that I think had I been a journalist or had the courage, I would have written it as a nonfiction expose. I've been in touch with her sons, Matthew, two of her three sons, Matthew and Paul, and they have kept on her work under the Daphne Project. So if you should be interested from the reading, it's something you might want to look up. So I'm going to start with the epigraph and just read a short part of the first chapter. You don't lose your soul all at once. You lose it a little bit at a time, incrementally, tiny imperceptible steps. Before you know it, you're doing things you never thought you would do. That's by Jordan Belfort. Chapter 1, May 4th, 2019, Gozo, Malta. The early morning sun streamed in through the leaded glass windows of the weathered farmhouse. Ariana Kalea rose from the child's bed and walked over to a dressing table under the wooden sill. She pulled a sweatshirt from a drawer and held it to her tear-stained face, inhaling the scent. It smelled of the sea. With temperatures well into 20 degrees Celsius, under different circumstances, she might already have been at the beach, making castles in the sand, listening to the whoops and cries of the little boy with the dark mop of hair and chocolate eyes. Come and see what I've made, he'd shout over the squawks of the gulls that sailed back and forth across the lapis sky. They would hover, waiting for the time Ariana would unpick unpack a picnic, and 5-year-old Max would oh so trustingly hold up pieces of bread for the birds to swoop down and snatch in their orange spotted beaks. "Be careful, darling, or you'll lose a finger," she would call to him. "Put it on the sand and they'll come for it." Each Friday, Ariana caught the ferry to Gozo, or as the old timers would say, Odesh. She would stand on the deck as the boat pulled into Mahar Harbor and feel the stress of her 60-hour work week melt away. As she breathed the fresh, salty air, it was as if she'd shirked off the ties that bound her to another life, one of never-ending legal cases that, even if she won, barely seemed to make a dent in the mainland's impervious underbelly of corruption. A haven for tourists, the archipelago's beauty concealed a secret that locals knew but outsiders seldom saw. Instead, they erected a polite facade, like you might do when bringing an old college chum home for the weekend, not wanting them to see how dysfunctional your family really was. Yet here she stood alone in Max's room, surrounded by his things, as if oceans away from that life. The smell of him mingled with the sea and sand and sun. She wiped her eyes and looked down at the garden below. There was his blue plastic wading pool that he'd sit in and play for hours. He was a happy, carefree little boy, and although homeschooled for reasons of security, he was bright and social. For that, she had Francesca to thank. A friend since boarding school, she lived on Gozo with Max during the week, whilst Ariana was working on the mainland, and then went back to her apartment in Valletta on the weekends. Francesca had witnessed the increasing vitriol and death threats Ariana had received following her bold statements to the media. Accusing senior government officials and heads of Malta's most prestigious corporations of corruption did not bode well for her safety. It was something she'd learned to live with, but when Max had become old enough to see what was being said about her on television, she agonized about whether to send him away until this investigation and prosecution, the biggest case of her legal career, was resolved. But how would she tell Francesca what she had just done? Before that, she needed to steel herself for an even more important call. The longer conversation would have to take place in person. In fact, she had already booked her flight to Calabria, Italy. That part had been easy. But what she'd been putting off for 5 years might be worse than the threats of any criminal she'd face down in court. She poured herself a glass of wine and braced herself to make the call. "Ovviamente, of course I'm not too busy," Niccolo Moretti said. "How could you even ask such a thing, Ariana? I always have time for you. How long can you stay?" "Only a couple of days, I'm afraid. I have to be back by midweek. But if you have Monday evening free..." See, I'll take you to the new ristorante that's opened up ahead of the season. It's vegetarian, but you'll love it. What time should I make reservations for?" "No, I'll cook," she said. "I'll have time to go to the market while you're at work." "Shall we say 8 o'clock at my place?" No, you'll be tired. Per favore, let me take you out." There was a pause in which she said nothing. While Nico sounded delighted she was coming, they both knew her schedule rarely allowed for such spontaneity, let alone an offer to cook him dinner. "Is everything all right?" he asked. "Yes, it's just that I need to speak with you about something important, alone." "All right. Can you tell me..." "Nico, I've got to go. I'll see you Monday at 8. And she was gone. Sunday was busy for Ariana. She had to tackle the mountain of laundry before starting her packing for Tropea. The fridge needed cleaning out for the week. No one would be there, something she'd still not told Francesca about. She went back into Max's room to put his clean clothes away, and once again wondered if she'd done the right thing. She tried not to dwell on the decision she'd made 5 years ago that she could never take back, the one that would change everything. What loomed ahead pushed and strained at her heart like the buffeting wind of an incoming storm. In less than 24 hours, she prayed to God that somehow Nico Moretti wouldn't hate her more than she hated herself. And I just want to say before, that is the end of the reading, but again, in real life, the Daphne Caruana Galizia, who is the fictional, the real life for my protagonist. She had just left her home. One of her sons was still in the house working. He heard the explosion, ran down the gravel road outside their home in bare feet, and her car was an inferno. It was a car bombing. It had been thrown into a farmer's field. It was an inferno. He couldn't do anything. And since then, the citizens of Valletta in Malta keep erecting a shrine to her, and the government keeps pulling it down. And the former prime minister, who finally was forced into resigning, was a part of the corruption. Her family still do not have justice. So to give you a bit of context, look up the Daphne Project. It's very interesting. Thank you.
Thanks, Karen. Awesome. So finally, you have me. I'm SM Freedman, Shoshana, and I grew up in Vancouver. I studied acting in New York and spent a decade as a private investigator back in Vancouver before I returned to my first love of writing. I currently have 4 books published by Thomas and Mercer and Dundurn Press, and I have more on the way. So also, if you can join me at 2:00 at the pandemic book launch, I'll be reading from The Day She Died, which is my pandemic baby. A lot of books that were published during the pandemic did not get the love and that they deserved, and we couldn't do anything in person, of course. So this is a wonderful thing that they're doing, is the pandemic book launch. I'll be reading from The Day She Died, and that tells the story of a woman who suffers brain damage in a near-fatal car accident, and she's tortured by repressed memories of her childhood, and she must choose between clinging to the lies that she used to survive her childhood or unearthing the secrets that she buried long ago. So that's The Day She Died, to be read later. But right now, I'm going to read from my latest psychological thriller, which came out this past fall, and that's Blood Atonement. It was selected as a top 100 best books of 2022 by the Globe and Mail, chosen by the Vancouver Sun and the province as one of 5 books to read this holiday season. Although it's kind of odd because it's really not a holiday book. But if you like murder and mayhem, read that for the holidays. Also, it was a finalist in the Crime Writers of Canada's Awards of Excellence. It tells the story of a woman named Grace who grows up in an isolated sect of the FLDS, or Fundamentalist Mormon Church. And if you're not aware of what that is, think Netflix's special Keep Sweet, Pray and Obey, or Under the Banner of Heaven. We actually have a sect of the FLDS up in rural BC in a town called Bountiful. So I fictionalized off of our true history in the area. At the age of 18, Grace escapes from her confinement. She leads 9 other children out, and they all escape together. But because of the trauma she experienced as a child, she suffers from dissociative identity disorder, which used to be called multiple personality disorder. So years later, when the other children that she helped to escape begin to die under suspicious circumstances, one of Grace's alter personalities becomes the prime suspect. And Grace has to determine if she's actually a killer or if she's about to be the next victim. So the story goes back and forth in time, chapter by chapter, into Grace's childhood, growing up in this sect, and into her present as she's dealing with this trauma and the threat to her life. So right now I'm going to read from the prologue, which is kind of like the bridge between her past and her present. It's the moment when she develops enough courage to escape the sect. Here we go. Grace was cleaning blood from her thighs when the police raided Brigham for the last time. At first, she paid little attention to the shouting outside the trailer window. She needed to finish what she was doing before her husband came home demanding dinner. She'd propped herself over the toilet, one hip wedged into the side of the sink, and her back pressed against the shower door. Her legs shook. Her hands trembled. Her brain was hot with fever and her good ear buzzed. Someone pounded on the side of the trailer, causing the walls to rattle. She lurched backward and grabbed the edge of the sink to keep from falling. Bloody rags splatted on the floor. "Grace, hurry! The police are here," Desiree said. The police. Now she heard the shouting, the crying, the chaos as children scattered into the forest. "I'm here! I'm coming! Be quick!" Her dress hung from the hook by the sink, pale green with yellowed lace trim, but there was no time for her to get dressed. She grabbed a throw blanket from the foot of the bed and wrapped it around herself to cover her blood-soaked temple undergarments. The world tipped sideways and slowly righted itself. Staggering forward, she somehow made it to the door and slammed a shoulder into it, unsticking the warped aluminum from its frame. She tumbled off balance down the outside stairs and would have fallen if her sister hadn't caught her. "Come on!" Desiree grabbed her arm and pulled. They ran beneath a moon that was low and bright in the sky. Once Grace's eyes adjusted, she could see perfectly well, which meant she could also be seen perfectly well. At the edge of the cornfield, reason or madness asserted itself. "Wait!" Desiree spun to face her, eyes wide with panic. "What are you doing? We have to go." Her sister's hair was pulled into a classic roll on top of her head and braided down her back. She panted, her bosom pressed against the cotton of her high-collared dress. Pimples dotted her chin. How long until Uncle G had a revelation about Desiree's marriage? She was already a year older than Grace had been. Desiree glanced toward the road. "Come on, they're catching up." This was true. The beams of their flashlights danced like fireflies as the police approached. Their voices grew louder. She felt Desiree's panic, could feel it swell within her own chest. The urge to keep running was almost overwhelming. It's what they'd been taught to do. They needed to protect their way of life, their chance at heaven, their profit. But blood trickled down her legs again. And more than anything, she wanted a better life for her sister. She grabbed Desiree's hands. Hers blazed with fever. Desiree's felt like ice. This is our chance. Realization and fear blossomed in Desiree's eyes. She shook her head and tried to pull her hands free. "We shouldn't." Grace squeezed. "We must." "But what about father and mother?" Grace's chest tightened with anxiety and guilt, but she shook her head. Too far down that path, and she'd decide to stay. And then her only way out would be death. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Truth was so hard to speak. She'd been raised to be sweet, and the words burned like acid on her tongue. She almost gagged on the enormity of what escaped her lips. "If I have to stay here any longer, I'll die, and so will you. How long until you're married?" "Oh, Grace." Desiree's eyes swam with tears. "You're 14. Your revelation is coming any day now." "Maybe I'll be lucky like our parents were." "Well, until Mother Rebecca joined the family." Desiree swallowed hard. "Was it just a game to you?" Grace asked. The police drew closer, the beams from their flashlights weaving and flickering. "I know you're scared, but we can't waste this chance. The others will be waiting for us." Desiree licked her lips, bobbing her head up and down. "All right, if they're really there, I'll do it." She wrapped an arm around her sister's waist, and together they ran along the edge of the cornfield. As Grace had predicted, the others were huddled beneath the scarecrow on the far end, but a quick count told her only 8 had made it. Grace rubbed a trembling hand across her brow, and it came away wet. Her bones felt hollow, and she could barely hear over the ringing in her good ear. "Where's Soraya?" No answer, just 8 sets of eyes begging for her leadership. "Oh no!" Desiree's jaw tightened and spittle flew from her mouth. Her stammer always got worse under stress. "We need to go look for her." The police lights grew distant, but somewhere nearby, men shouted. It sounded like Uncle Red and maybe Joseph Barlow. They'd be rounding up the children, herding them to the forest. "There's no time. We have to go," Rulon said. He was Uncle G's 6th son and her husband's half-brother. They had the same blonde hair and pale eyes, but her husband was salt to Rulon's sugar. Desiree spoke through her fingers. "We can't just leave her." "It won't be for long," Rulon said. "Once we tell our story, they'll come back to rescue the rest." "Maybe she's already waiting on the road," Tabby said. Joseph Barlow spotted them and strode across the cornfield in their direction. "What are you doing there? All of you, to the forest!" "Hurry, everyone, buddy up," Grace said. "Stay with me." "Hey!" Barlow called after them. They rolled like thunder across the fields and gravel, linked hand to hand. Grace's legs trembled with exertion, threatening to collapse beneath her, but the others depended on her, so she pushed forward. They made it to the main road with no sign of Soraya. Up close, the police looked terrifying. They moved in formation, wearing dark helmets and thick vests, and one by one she felt the others slow, paralyzed by the same fear that bloomed inside her own chest. This was their enemy in the flesh. An officer stepped out of formation and pulled off his helmet. He had a shock of dark hair above a broad face. Their eyes met, and his arms opened as though in welcome. She squeezed Desiree's hand and pulled Tabby close. The girls trembled against her side, thin as sparrows. "Don't be afraid. God is with us." She ran toward the officer's open arms, and the children followed. So that's Blood Atonement. And so that concludes our readings. As a reminder, you can purchase ours and many other great books at 32 Books. Thank you to Crime Writers of Canada for sponsoring this event. I'm always grateful for every Crime Writers of Canada event that I get to participate in. And thank you to all the staff and volunteers at Word Vancouver for making this possible. There are plenty of more events happening throughout the day, so please be sure to check them out. Thank you.
It was good to see you yesterday, and I wouldn't have missed it if I